Yeah. Now we're going to shift to the Crown Minerals Amendment Bill. Now this is going to be a weird one, but thank you, Laura, for picking this up.
No problem.
Let's kick off from submitter Chloe Swarbrick.
Here, on behalf of the Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand and nearly 4,000 New Zealanders who signed on to this submission in the mere 4 days that the government gave the public to organise themselves. And I know that this is in addition to the 36,000 New Zealanders who signed on to our petition to keep the oil and gas ban in place, which I'll be submitting to the Environment Select Committee on Thursday, the 17th of October. So here we are. Nearly 2 years ago, almost 2 million Aucklanders watched as our city went underwater. A few weeks later, similar devastation visited the Hawke's Bay. And in the last few days, Otago has been confronted with the latest in climate change charged extreme weather. Whether it's Northland, Auckland, the East Coast, the West Coast, Canterbury Plains, top of the South, or the Deep South, whether it's flood or it's drought, all of the politicians here know that the more carbon emissions that our decisions enable, the worse and the more frequent that those life-threatening weather events become. If any of you disagree with the science, I dare you to speak up. If you don't, then you accept the science. And those of you who intend to wave this bill through, do so, knowing full well that what you are doing is making the active, conscious, and informed decision to increase emissions and make the lives of the people that you say you represent so much harder. This isn't an academic debate anymore. Climate change charged weather events are the direct experience of New Zealanders. It is within this committee's power to mitigate climate changing emissions or to choose to increase those emissions to line the pockets of fossil fuel executives, which is what this bill represents. Now, the Coalition promised to make decisions based on data and evidence, so here is some data and evidence. In 2021, the International Energy Agency found that in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, there could be no new oil and gas fields approved for development. That was 3 years ago. We already have over 30 renewable energy projects consented or near consented in this country, but they haven't been built because of structural profit-driven issues within the electricity sector. Gas production peaked in Aotearoa, New Zealand back in 2001 and has been steadily falling since 2014, 4 years before the exploration ban was put in place. Yep. It takes an average of 16 years to take an oil and gas field in this country from exploration to production. The Prime Minister glibly thanked me for informing him about this at question time a few weeks ago, but it's got to be one of the most brain-melting facts to understand about what this government is trying to push through. Committee members, if you help push this law through, you lock our country into exploration and production of more climate-burning fossil fuels, not just 3 years after the International Energy Agency told everyone to stop doing precisely that, but you lock us into producing and depending on fossil fuels 16 plus years into the future. Now, if you want a resilient energy system, investment in distributed renewable energy is our future, but you actively undermine that with this bill. The government's own initial advice shows that the reversal of this oil and gas ban would produce 3 times the number of emissions that are being reduced in the government's own draft emissions reduction plan. Yet somehow, even worse, is the additional change to the purpose of the Crown Minerals Act from managing mining to promoting mining. In practice, this means that the Crown will no longer exercise its responsibility to manage how mining occurs, where mining takes place, and to regulate whether or not mining is taking place in an environmentally responsible manner. The idea that publicly elected officials in the 21st century would be actively cheerleading extractive industries instead of ensuring that our planet's scarce resources and delicately balanced life-giving climate is protected, frankly, beggars belief. Then there is the changes to the decommissioning regime, which is profoundly irresponsible and unjustifiable, whichever way you look at it. Decommissioning of oil fields like the Tui oil field left deserted in 2019 and the financial collapse of Tamarins Taranaki have cost the country, the taxpayers that the coalition government loves to talk about, close to $500 million. Yet here we're presented with a law change not to create greater protections from this kind of financial liability, but to actively weaken them. So committee members, if you rubber stamp this bill, you are choosing not only to pour oil and gas on the climate crisis fire, not only to turn ministers into cheerleaders for that, but also to increase the financial liability for the government and everyday New Zealanders. Passing this bill will allow greater flexibility around financial securities for fossil fuel companies. Changing trialling liability means that past operators or permit holders of oil fields will no longer have responsibility for those oil fields. Weakening post-decommissioning liability removes requirements for fossil fuel companies to provide payments as security of the potential risk of those oil fields. Combined, these are beyond belief hall passes to an industry that is directly responsible for a large proportion of global emissions, to go out and to take risky decisions to explore for oil and gas and to drill our environment with little concern for being held to account or responsible for any issues or major problems. But wait, there's more. You also know that this bill poses huge international legal and reputational risks. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade advised the government that reversing the ban is, and I quote, inconsistent with the obligation in several of New Zealand's free trade agreements not to reduce environmental protections for the purposes of encouraging trade or investment, end quote. And this could be legally challenged by a trading partner. MFAT also states that reversing the ban, and I quote, could be received as New Zealand not intending to meet its nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, unless appropriate measures are taken to demonstrate how the additional emissions will be offset, end quote. Yet, Treasury and the Ministry for the Environment have warned that the cost of overseas offsets required to meet that nationally determined contribution could cost up to $23 billion by 2030. The main method the government has to reduce that cost is rapid domestic emissions reduction, but this bill does the opposite of that. And then there's the risk to our oceans. We all know the significant impacts that an oil spill can have. We only need to look at the Deepwater Horizon blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, which spilled over 450 million litres of oil into the Gulf, smothering and drowning marine life in oil. For an illustration closer to home, the Rena oil spill, Aotearoa New Zealand's worst environmental maritime disaster, saw over 1,000 birds die after being doused in oil and cost $700 million to clean up. Then there's the seismic blasting, an incredibly destructive exploration practice where seismic air guns let off blasts every 8 seconds. These blasts are torture for marine mammals like dolphins and whales and can last 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months at a time. Nothing about oil and gas drilling is good for marine ecosystems and life. And the cost of a blowout or an oil spill in Aotearoa, not just economically, but socially and environmentally, will be immeasurable and long-lasting. But you all know all of
cost the
this.
taxpayer a lot
Government
of money
members, if you choose to wave this bill through, you do so knowing about the real-world harm that you are choosing to increase. You do so knowing that you are, based on the data and evidence, choosing not to mitigate, but to actively increase the frequency and severity of climate change-charged weather events ravaging this country. You do so knowing about the costs that you could impose on New Zealanders, the damage to our reputation and the legal risk that ensues. You do so knowing about the potential damage to our oceans and the wildlife that call it home. You do so knowing that you could make a different choice. You can stand on the right side of history to actively improve things for people and planet instead of actively choosing to make them worse. You have the power and you are responsible for what happens next. And you should know that when the Greens are next in government, we will reinstate the scientifically necessary ban on oil and gas exploration, and we will revoke any permits that you issue for drilling. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So I've got nothing. I've got nothing bad to say about what Chloe submitted. I mean, she's passionate, etc. But two things. Number one, what we're seeing is a repivoting of the Green Party into climate justice and that sort of narrative. And I wonder whether or not that is the pivot now of the Green Party to get back to their basics or get back to their base, because their base are looking at them thinking, how did you go so far, so wrong, so quickly? The second thing is I'm not a big fan or in favour of politicians using the select committee process themselves for submissions. You are an elected representative, you have your time in Parliament. The select committee process for 10 minutes or so is for members of the public and organisations to submit on their thoughts on particular bills. It's not for politicians to, no matter where they come from, to use the select committee process in the body of a sitting Parliament to ply their views. That's not what the select committee process is for. If you want to do it that way, become a lobbyist with some organisation outside of the body politic in Parliament. It's for the people. It's not for politicians. That's the second thing. Nothing in what Chloe says is a surprise. I mean, I think every time this government hears the word science or scientific, they have an allergic reaction that will probably form the basis of some child's thesis in the course or PhD studies in the coming years. This government doesn't understand that even just for the basics. For example, and I mentioned it before about how this government likes to say, we're better economic managers than everybody else in the other lot. Just watch us go, go, go. Well, the problem that I've got with this whole, the whole Crown Minerals stuff is that the evidence quite clearly tells us that the economic return on investment versus the environmental impact is just non-existent. I mean, 3% of royalties on average, I think, is what the Crown extracts from this. And even for the royalties to work, we might be able to get everything from PAYE to profits that could be taxable remaining in New Zealand, etc., etc. But no, these mining companies, largely from Australia, will pick it up and transport it back to their home country for their own shareholders. So,
we export all of our crude oil.
Well,
You
yeah,
don't even use it here.
it's it's absolutely it's fantasy. But the classic example of where governments overstep their mark and their reach is in the case of what's going on with the of Taranaki. It's been very clear that multiple entities in the branches of our judiciary and government and process have indicated very clearly that it is a dud deal. So, but no, that's all right. We're going to usurp everything. Sorry, my dog is yelping again.
We've got an interesting